Thank you, Wellbeing. Next, we turn to Dr. Nala to speak to the long-term impacts on the healthcare system and the people of Gaza. Dr. Nala is a psychiatry resident. She's a Syrian-Canadian third-year psychiatry resident in Ontario, Canada, and is passionate about mental health, equity, and healthcare access. She has a particular interest in cultural psychiatry and advocates for intersectionality in mental health care. She uses social media platforms as a tool for advocacy and awareness, particularly for what is happening in Palestine. And I must say that, when I watched Dr. Nala's Instagram account and just was absolutely infected with her passion and her advocacy work, and it's an absolute pleasure to invite her to speak to us.
Thank you so much. Just want to make sure the mic is okay before I start. So, like my colleague, Yipeng kind of gave context to who he is and himself here today, I'll do the same. I was born in Syria to Syrian parents, and they migrated here, and similar to Yipeng's parents, had passed a test and had to meet many criteria and acquire a number of points to become skilled migrants and come to this country and be settlers on stolen land. Myself as well, settler on stolen land. I'm not Palestinian. I want to make sure I say that because what I'm sharing today, even though, yes, I'm from a country very close to Palestine, and yes, my entire life has been free Palestine, like from the minute I was born and every day of my life, I still cannot speak from the perspective of a Palestinian. Everything I'm sharing today and everything I share, I try to take from my Palestinian colleagues, from scholars, from people I look up to and their knowledge that they've transferred to the world and put it kind of my own spin on it and add more context or add my thoughts on it, but it's their knowledge that I'm sharing with you today. It's not mine. I just want to make sure I make that very clear. And also that just because I'm not Palestinian, it doesn't mean that that labor is always to fall on Palestinians. And I think Jada reminded us of that when we were meeting, to say that it doesn't always have to be Palestinians on a panel speaking to the world, talking about what they've experienced. They've been doing that for over 76 years. They've been doing that. So it's also on us to bear witness and to highlight what happens to Palestinians, what has happened to Palestinians, and advocate for them. So I want to share a quote from a film by Dr. Samah Jabir, who is a psychiatrist in the West Bank. If you haven't watched it, you should. It's called Beyond the Front Lines. One of the quotes that she said is, "The more that Israelis breathe, the more that Palestinians choke." I wanted to start off with that because my lens is a mental health lens, and mental health for me is not just your one aspect of you, it's your whole being, it's very holistic. However, it's not in the way that I guess the Western holistic definition is. And I wanted to break down what that means to choke, what that feeling of choking means from what I learned from her and again from Palestinian colleagues. And I want to break it down into very different categories of how the Zionist project, the Zionist entity, the occupation, this genocide and the previous genocides, what they've done in all these different areas to persistently keep their foot on the neck of a Palestinian, to keep them choking and to erase all these aspects of their being, and in turn impact their mental well-being and their overall health. So the first thing I want to mention is land. Similar to our indigenous, the indigenous teachings about this connection to land and being of the land, Palestinians talk about that incessantly. They talk about that so much that this connection to land it's in your body, it's really in every fiber of your body, of your being. And what has consistently been shown from Palestinians is this removal of land is connected to like an inner death. Like you see an olive tree uprooted or burned and you feel it in your body, in your soul. You're being harmed directly as a Palestinian. And I think that colonizers and individuals who colonize and take land know that. They know how deeply connected and how intertwined the survival of indigenous communities are to land. And even if you don't directly harm a person, if you harm their land, you harm their olive trees, you harm their farms, you harm their animals, you harm anything on their land, you are directly harming them. That is a form of a slow genocide. And this was so exemplified by a young child in Gaza now, during this genocide, who was walking by a field of olive trees that he said, these are my family's olive trees. We had hundreds of olive trees here, and he's walking by. He's probably 8. I'm sure some of you have seen his videos. He's a child. And he's saying, there were so many here, and we have to burn the wood of these olive trees to live, to cook, to do anything. We have no fuel, so we're burning our own trees. It's such a form of humiliation and awfulness to do that to a people who are so connected to olive trees. We have to do that because we're going to die. We can't survive. And he's walking past it, and he's devastated. And that connection doesn't have to be necessarily taught over decades or years. He's 8, and he knows that. And that's happening right now. That's been happening for decades. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, is this connection to land, and removal of land is a really, really form of mental destruction, of mental harm. The other thing we talked about, and Jada mentioned, is this cultural and traditional type of harm that has been happening to Palestinians. And one specific thing that I want to highlight, because I feel like I said, nothing I'm saying is new. I'm really just disseminating information that has been said before, but just trying to, contextualize everything. But this idea of stealing things that are very much Palestinian and labeling them as Israeli. And that is a very, it's not a unique thing to Palestine, but it's a very, very common thing. I'm sure you've seen it so many times on social media where, a thobe, which is a traditional Palestinian dress, is labeled an Israeli dress, which is like, yeah, I've seen that before. There was an event held where it was like an Israeli awareness or an Israeli event, and the women were wearing thobes in that event, and it was to showcase Israel. Or the Israeli food that is now kind of the Palestinian food, obviously, originally, that it's kind of labeled Israeli. The theft of this culture, of this tradition, of these foods, of this is like, again, a form of harming individuals mentally and physically. Another aspect of this is preventing kind of community, preventing individuals in Palestine, in the occupied territories, and in Gaza from being able to meet in community and grieve. So I'm sure many of us have seen, even in a situation where an individual is murdered, they're directly attacked when they try to go into community to grieve the loss of that person, or to go to a ceremony for that person afterwards, so to pray for them, or however it looks, a funeral, whatever that is, that removal of that process, that community, again, is such a destruction of a person's mental well-being. They're not even allowed to grieve the losses that were enacted by that same group of individuals by Israel. So they're harmed directly by that murder, that loss of life, and then again in their own process of grieving, which is such a communal thing. For Palestinians, they're bombed, they're sniped, they're harmed, they're attacked. All of these things are so central to the well-being and sustaining an entire community and a population. So the more and more that you remove them, the more and more that you punish people for congregating, for prayer, for funerals, the more and more that you make them, erase them from their own traditions and their cultures, it is demoralizing. And I'm not saying that it's succeeded or it's prevented Palestinians from sustaining themselves and continuing, but that is the intention. It's the intention to keep them from doing that so that they do not continue to perpetuate their culture. Another, reflection that I had when I was watching Dr. Samah Shaba's documentary is that in so many realms of a person's life, and just for context, this was in the West Bank, not specifically Gaza, but in so many realms of one person's life, there is so much destruction. So in one person, they would have, for example, lost their brother. Their brother might have been sniped and murdered. Their other brother has been in detention for 20 years and has been tortured. They can see it through either visual imagery on TV or through photos, but they can never actually go see their other sibling. This one person, their mother, might be grieving so much and might be in such pain that they cannot communicate to their family. They can't even talk to them. They can't even engage anymore because their grief is so overpowering. They cannot manage all that has been happening to their family. Their dad might be working, on Israeli territory and might have to cross checkpoints every day and barely be at home with their family. So this is such a destruction of a person's being in every realm, so in their entire family, in their ability to seek education, in their ability to have a future, in their ability to simply survive. And I want to read another quote that Dr. Samah Jabir wrote as well about this. Give me 1 second to find it. You know what, I'll just go on here. Because trauma in Palestine is so prevalent, there are overlapping ripples of traumatic grief. A young man is affected by expanding circles of injury. He lives in a refugee camp because his grandfather's home and land were seized. His mother has been preoccupied with chronic depression for 20 years, following the arrest and torture of his older brother. His neighbor's home was recently demolished. His classmate was killed in a demonstration. With this background, how do we locate the source of his chest pain when medical causes have been ruled out? The overabundance of traumatic events in the environment make it difficult to establish etiology. The repetition of trauma is a challenge to treatment efforts. So again, because I'm using this mental health lens, there's also that physical and somatic experience of our mental health experiences. So it shows up in our bodies, it shows up in how we present ourselves, how we speak, it shows up everywhere really. And what she highlights there is this, how do I know that even, yes, I don't know that it's I do know that it's not a medical cause of chest pain. How do I know where this came from? Every moment of this person's life has been grief and trauma and dehumanization and humiliation and harm and destruction. And it's hard to pinpoint the location, the time, the source. It is all over. It is everywhere. Dr. Samah Jabir is also one of the people that coined the term that there is no PTSD. There's no post to the trauma of the individuals in Palestine. It is from birth. It is still now. And one thing I remember mentioning, I'll switch over back to Gaza, is that when people talk about Gaza and say, you know, it was so beautiful before this destruction, this most recent destruction, we should say, they say that, but we know that in the background of that, they were still being starved in essence, right? There was still a limitation on how much water each person could eat, how much food they could have, electricity per day. There were still kids learning in dark rooms every single day because they were cutting off electricity to Gaza whenever they wanted to. They're still in occupied territory. But they know what it feels like to be bombarded. They know what it feels like to have their home demolished. They know what it feels like to have other things happen to them, that is relief. There is no post. There's never a post. It's constant. It's continuous. It never ends. And if the crimes and the aggression is just a lesser aggression than a complete bombardment and destruction, they show that in this beautiful light and say, look at how our life used to be. I wish we could go back to that. And we would hate a minute of their life in Gaza before this genocide. We would hate. None of us. We would not be able to tolerate what happens to them. So there is really no post, and I think that is a very, privileged way to look at things, especially as a person trained in the West, that we have to also look at how we diagnose, how we look at mental health conditions as well when we look at populations like the Palestinian population, the indigenous communities, the indigenous population too. I don't know how much time I have left, I'm sorry. Do I have more time? Okay, I will quickly want to mention something that was brought up in our meeting, kind of discussing what we're going to talk about today, and it was this idea of feeling like when you want to talk about what's happening in the world or the sort of things that are happening in the world, and you feel like your body won't let you say it, it won't let you communicate it, it won't let you articulate it. You might not have experienced this, but after it was mentioned, I spoke with a few of my friends and colleagues, and it's actually quite common, this idea of your body not even letting you utter the horrible things that either have happened to you or that you've witnessed. Again, I'm speaking about Dr. Samah Jabir so much because I asked for her insights on this, and I wanted to share with you what she said. And she told me that for the Palestinian population especially, there has been so much physical repression, there has been so much silencing physically, so being sent to jail, literally being killed, literally having if you speak up, having this threat of your daughters or the women in your family being harmed, of you losing your home, etc., of you never having to be able to seek higher education, get a job, anything. So that physical repression also manifests, that systemic repression also manifests physically in this inability to actually utter the words because you know that you will be harmed for it, so your body won't let you, and it's a form of self-protection, self-preservation. Another thing is that when Palestinians have screamed out loud, and to all of us in this room, we're all here for a reason, we've all, I hope, seen videos of what they've told us and seen their posts and seen what they've shared with us. They've been screaming this to the world for so long and met with even more support to their occupier, even more support to the people that are colonizing and occupying them and harming them. It's at what point can you keep screaming and yelling, this is what's happening to me, this is what's happening to me, this is what's happening to me? It is also a physical manifestation of that too, that inability to utter those words. So it's not just falling on deaf ears. People are listening and they're like, actually, yeah, we're going to continue doing that to you. It's an experience that, again, you know, Indigenous communities here will very much relate to and Palestinians can relate to. One last thing I wanted to mention as well is, so as a resident working here in Ontario and hearing what happened to Yipeng and hearing what happened to so many of my other colleagues with suspensions and with other, you know, being called into offices to talk about things because they posted Free Palestine, like ridiculous things like that, it will make you feel like you are the wrong one, like you're the problem. It's you that is, I don't want to use like this, like you're not, I don't like the word crazy, but you feel that way. I'm sure many of us feel that way navigating the world, thinking like, why does no one care? Like, why am I feeling this way? And everyone else is just moving along with their lives. And I hope that being in this room today, and I'm sure other events you've attended, you recognize in this community that you're not. And I hope that, you know, from also hearing from our stories and from, you know, what we've talked about today, that it shows you that you're not. And one thing that I also want to mention is through the social media posts that I've posted where I very clearly speak directly at healthcare professionals and say, what are you doing? Like, how are you okay with this? How do you show up every single day at work and talk about football games and Taylor Swift? There is a genocide happening, and I'll do that. And then over time, over the last 6 months, even though it should have happened a long time ago, many physicians that work with me have messaged and said, hey, what can I do? And it's happening. So I hope that that also gives you that glimmer of hope that you keep doing what you're doing and show up in these communities and these spaces, and you're literally not crazy. Like, I know that part of the mental well-being is so heavy for us because we feel like we're just losing our minds watching this. And you're not, and you're human, and it's natural to feel that way when you're witnessing such a level of atrocity that should just never, ever be happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan. And you made some remarks that take us into our last speaker before we have a closing session. So the onslaught in Gaza has had a very particular impact on humanitarian efforts in the Strip. Israeli imposed closure on the movement of goods and people to and from Gaza dates back to 1991, when Israel cancelled the general exit permit for Palestinians in the occupied territories. This policy was initially temporary, but eventually developed into a permanent administrative measure in March of 1993. And as a result, Gazans are reliant on the support provided by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, that provides human development and humanitarian services that encompass primary and vocational education, primary health care, relief and social services, infrastructure and camp improvement, microfinance, and emergency response, including in situations of armed conflict. And as such, it was logical that we should include a focus on UNRWA in this meeting. Unfortunately, we've had some technical difficulties with the Zoom connection because we were going to be able to invite and welcome Dr. Akira Seta, Director of the Health Department of UNRWA and the World Health Organization Special Representative at UNRWA, to provide us with an update on the work being done by UNRWA and the impact of the invasion and inhumane restrictions on support to the agency. But Dr. Seta has kindly, in the moments before this meeting, once we realized that we had the technical glitches, been able to prepare a very short video, and we're going to watch it now. Thank you.
Hey, right. I am now. Good morning. Today is the World Health Day. The theme of this year is My Health, My Rights. I am now in Gaza. You can see behind me, tents on the street, people living on the street. Their right to their health is totally damaged. It's very important for us to make sure the right to health will maintain, so people have a right to healthy life and a healthy living. We are doing everything. However, the entire environment does not allow us to achieve my rights, my health. That you can see from my behind very clearly. It's important in the day of the World Health Day, we should remember the rights to health is our fundamental right. This is the UNRWA Health Center in South Sudan in Gaza. UNRWA continues to provide primary health care through 7 health centers now, together with the 70 to 80 health monitoring shelters. They provide a daily consultation on the medical issues, around 25,000 people. They provide vaccination, so far 65,000 people, as well as care for the mothers, and they care for the people with diabetes, hypertension, and they care for the oral health, and everything. UNRWA is a lifeline in Gaza in providing very important life-saving primary health care.
We'll be sure to convey our thanks to Dr. Seta for that short video clip. So it's now my great pleasure to welcome Adol Iskander to facilitate a panel discussion with our speakers and make summary and closing remarks, and for me to step back and listen. Adol Iskander is an associate professor of global communication at Simon Fraser University and graduate chair in the School of Communication. He is the author, co-author, and editor of several works, including Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution, Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism, Edward Said, A Legacy of Emancipation and Representation, and Mediating the Arab Uprisings, and Media Evolution on the Eve of the Arab Spring. Adol's work deals with media, identity, and politics. His engaged participatory research includes supporting knowledge productions through scholarly digital publishing, and his community research agenda involves showcasing local grassroots participatory creative production by communities in the Middle East to confront the rise of extremism. I met Adol some months ago and have been involved with him in a number of projects since then, and it's always been an inspiration to work with you, Adol, and it's a joy to hand over to you. Thank you.
Adol has let me just say something before he dives into facilitating. We've just heard an enormous amount of, troubling is not the word, but painful information. And I just want to remind each of you while you're sitting here to just give yourself a breath. And if that feels good, give yourself another. It is a privilege to be able to breathe. So before we dive into a panel discussion, it might help for each of you to just come back to your own bodies if you're feeling a bit flooded.
Thank you so much, Jada. I have to say it's very difficult to commence with this discussion, but if you don't mind, I'll take the opportunity of having the microphone for just a brief moment to express our heartfelt gratitude to everyone who made this event possible. voice and a space. And luckily, we've got all three here today. So I thank you all for being here. As Kendra said, I feel like an imposter here because as a non-healthcare professional, I do kind of fake being a physician sometimes. I mentioned that, I come from like 4 generations of physicians, and I had to become a PhD to be able to get away with faking being a doctor. But I will say that one of the things that I recall from the experience of living with physicians my whole life is the importance of being able to find one's vitals, right? Like the idea that, okay, is there an emergency? The very few things that I know to do is to find a pulse, check blood pressure, see if someone's breathing, right? And the one thing that I'm always thinking about is where one finds the pulse. I remember distinctly, like the ulnar and the radial, pulse, where to find it. Dig deep, go behind the pisiform bone, like look for that pulse, right? And the one thing that I've been thinking as of late is the extent to which those who remain silent, I understand remaining silent on the current circumstances has a lot to do with the perceived risk and threat to one's well-being, especially in the climate of complete erasure and complete dehumanization as we've listened thus far. But for those who remain steadfastly supportive of the campaign of genocide, the question I'd like to pose to them is, where is their pulse? Can they find the pulse? Because really, this is no longer about, whether or not you support people's rights to self-determination. It's about people's rights to literally exist. I go back to something that Edward Said said some time ago, years ago now. He said, we're being told by the Israelis that we don't really exist. But we are there. There are villages, and there were villages. There are cities, and there were cities. There was a Palestinian society before 1948, unlike some PC ministers like me. So, ministers of higher education, I'll remind you. So at any rate, but Edward Said says we do exist. So in light of this desire and calculated intent, structurally and institutionally, to erase Palestinians from existence, their memories, their livelihood, everything that we've seen in Gaza, but things that are even more systematic, whereby the erasure of memory and the erasure of the right to grieve and mourn, as Dr. Nala said. Where do we go from here? And I wanted to open this up a little bit to explore some of the themes that I feel are very salient. And the first has to do with the right to bear children and continue one's community. It comes as no surprise that as we think about the livelihood of Palestinians and their right to continue existing, I mean, just the circumstance today with the woman who had to leave, I hope she's okay. I know that she received ambulatory care, so hopefully she's okay. But to think about what it means to be a pregnant woman in Gaza today. I mean, I cannot believe how incredibly painful it must be to, and I've heard, and I'm sure all of you have too, stories of women having to undergo C-sections without anesthetic on basically floors that have not been sanitized. The likelihood of the risks to one's well-being and health is really quite shocking. And just before I walked into the auditorium today, my friend and colleague, the only Palestinian who teaches here at SFU, gifted me something, and I have to show it to you all, right? Like, I'm going to hold this up. This is a T-shirt by Indigenous artist Phil Gray. I don't know if you see this, right? You see that? Okay. And there is kind of I feel like there's a spiritual does not matter how much effort, time, energy, resources, and money are marshaled to completely erase people off the face of this earth. You can't do it. You cannot do it. And one of the things that is a cruel reminder to those intent on the complete annihilation of Palestinian life is that there are still 5 million Palestinians living on historic Palestinian land, and 50 million who live around the world, and billions of those who are in solidarity with Palestine today. So this message is not going to be erased, and these people will not be erased. So I'm sorry, that was I had to get that off my chest, okay? Now enough about me. I'm around, you guys are not. Okay, so I want to turn to Wellbeing. You said a lot of things that we rarely hear from healthcare practitioners. And maybe it's because we are under the assumption that healthcare workers are designed and destined and trained to just do your job, right? Like, don't think about big picture. What does it mean to discuss, like, colonialism, apartheid? These are all perhaps abstractions. And so many of your peers and colleagues are not doing that. Is it by design? What is it about one's medical training, and what is it about your experience that has made you capable of seeing beyond the blind spots?
Thank you for the question. Simply put, it wasn't how I was trained, right? The people that helped train me, and many of whom are not clinicians, right? I credit my mentors and patients who are Inuit, who are Haudenosaunee, who have taught me so much of what it means to be Indigenous on stolen land and to be dehumanized in the context of Canada, to know that medical institutions and the system of knowledge of Western medicine in particular is extremely harmful and extractive and dehumanizes people and justifies things like slavery, justifies things like experimenting on Indigenous children and bodies to test the limits of nutrition, to sterilize people with uteruses so that they cannot have children in Canada, in the US. And so it was not how I was trained to enter medicine. And I think more and more people recognize the system of harm. And we think about medicine, Western medicine, as understanding disease and illness, as opposed to a true system of well-being and the attainment of health. And I think that's why I've also pivoted away from just medicine, right? Like, to think about population health and public health, thinking about the structural determinants, then we have to acknowledge the impacts of capitalism and colonialism and imperialism on people's bodies and communities. And I was thinking, like, I was reflecting on why, I didn't share more about my time at the Tal Satan Clinic, which was mentioned in the video, is because those are the symptoms. I think about, like, the patients that I looked after that, like this clinic that was just mentioned, when I went to it, didn't have antibiotics. And we brought antibiotics, started using them, and so many children were, like, forcibly starved and dehydrated, and all we could offer them was IV fluid. And, and outbreaks of hepatitis A, conditions like rickets disease, children that were walking before, not walking anymore, children that should be walking at, like, 12 months of age, 14 months of age, are not walking because of malnutrition. It's not super helpful to talk about, like, those symptoms when we know the root causes are the system of apartheid, the structural oppression. So we have to name, like, we have to get the diagnosis right.
Palestinians in Gaza who've been subjected to unspeakable, devastating horrors that are indescribable, as you said, and perhaps a lot of those narratives may not come out because of the forced silence and the implicit self-censorship out of fear and other reasons. So how do you begin to address this?
Okay, just going to check if this, yeah, okay, it's working. I don't know how to address it, but I'm going to share some of my thoughts on that. I've been very privileged to be able to work with people in Gaza right now. It's very informal. I haven't gone like Yipeng has gone, but being able to do virtual care with patients there and individuals there. And I think there are still, I hope this is received well. I want to explain it as well as I can. There's still a humanness to individuals that live within or under an occupation, who've lived numerous bombardments. So the average individual in Gaza has lived through 4 to 5 bombardments in their life already. There's a humanness to them still that they're intergenerational manifestations of this trauma. It's not just, it's similar to what we would see in an individual here, for example, or like an individual anywhere in the world. A lot of them might not say, oh, my trauma doesn't come from the bombing or the homes being demolished or anything like that. It comes from like what happened to me as a child by this person, or what I witnessed between my parents, or the substance use that I got into. Like, again, just this sort of humanness that we see here, this natural reaction to generations of trauma that we see here in Canada and in North America. Although we know, obviously, in the context of being within an environment where you're being bombarded every few months or every year, and that obviously contributes. But if the question is about this intergenerational manifestation, it's very similar. It's in individuals developing abusive patterns in relationships and witnessing that within your family and being victim to that yourself, whether you experience it directly or you see it in your family. Individuals falling through substance use disorders, other forms of assault and abuse as a child. Like, this is something that comes up with the people I talk to right now. They're experiencing a genocide. They're being starved, and that's the stuff they're talking to me about. So it shows up in that way, and the way that we would manage it, as best as we can, is education. So teaching individuals about where that can come from, how generations after generation can manifest a trauma that happened that didn't actually directly happen to them. It might have happened to their parents or their grandparents, and it shows up in these different ways with each generation. And then after education is sort of this process of safely sharing and discussing and processing. Again, I say safely. It's really hard to do that virtually, but safely processing it, and then obviously looking at the manifestations in themselves, in their relationships, in their function, and things like that. But I'm a Western-trained psychiatry resident. I am not an expert, and I should not be the person that teaches individuals about this. Like Yipeng mentioned, a lot of my learning about what it means to be a good physician came from like my mom's mom and her traditional healing and what she does when people are not feeling well, from learning about traditional healers in South Africa, from learning about traditional healers really in the world. That that's what has shaped me and made me a better person as a physician. And I want to give one example just to also kind of add on to the question about like how it looks like in practice. So I want to give the example of a time when I was seeing a patient on call. And if you don't know what call is, we work for 24 hours straight. So we don't stop working. We are on call for 24 hours. So we could be working from 1 hour to the final hour nonstop. And I was on call one day, and I was on my probably 18th hour, and I was not my best self, and I was not a good physician. And I know that. We're not good at that time. And I saw a patient who was Indigenous and was expressing multiple concerns, and I could hear it in myself, and I could feel it in myself that I was so resistant to coming out of that very rigid way of questioning and asking questions and getting to the bottom of what I needed to get to in that moment, which is, do you need to be admitted or not? And that's so unfortunate that that's the way I was taught. That is, am I admitting you or am I not admitting you? And that's all I need to figure out today. And I don't have space and room to give you the time that you are owed in this room with me today. And I could feel it, and it was so frustrating. And it was something that I needed to, I've since reflected on, and I'm trying to work on. But I could sense it in the patient too, and saying, but this, but I want, and then I'm thinking like, okay, I just need to figure out what I'm doing right now with this individual, with this patient. And it's challenging that. It's recognizing that we are so flawed and that we're not doing what the communities that we're serving need, and it's learning from them to address things like this intergenerational representation of trauma, the manifestations of symptoms, and how we can best help them as well.
Yeah, I think it's not, when we're thinking about how to change models work, how do we bring about change, I think we don't focus on the naysayers at 6 months into a genocide. I think we focus on growing our movement and growing our strengths. And I also think we learn from each other. I've been told a great many times in the last 6 months that it's because I've put people in uncomfortable situations and asked them to speak or asked them to come and hold my hand at an action or a rally, and putting them there, asking for their time and their presence, has allowed them to see that it actually feels better. And that's made change. And I think very tender acts bring about change. So my mom wasn't comfortable talking about Palestine. She just wasn't. It was too much. And the too much came from her own experience through residential school and harm, witnessing harm against children, being harmed as a child. And so the way I actually engaged her was to sit with her and make signs for an action. And I would, we cut the paper or the cardboard. Making signs is totally my love language. I love it. So I would write it out in pencil, and then I would sort of slide it across the table. And my mom, I strategically gave her the ones that were more Indigenous focused, like No Peace on Stolen Land. And so she would read it, and then she would like, yeah, that's really true. And so a night of sitting together and making signs actually opened it up. And she could see through the messaging that this is the same. And she just agreed, like she was having her own conversation, and that cracked it open. So I think that actually the bearing witness is one thing, and I'll just say there's something about hardening that we are trying to remain soft enough to access our humanity. And I think admittedly, I'll just speak for myself. I have hardened in ways that I am not comfortable with, that I absolutely reject Zionism, but it turns out I often can't find humanity in Zionists, and I will shut them out in ways forgetting their humanity, and therefore, how can we expect them to find that pathway if they have no place? So, and I don't make it my business to go and talk to Zionists. I actually, I don't have patience for that. But I think some people do. And so that's when I'm like, your cousins are freaking out. Go talk to them. We have those responsibilities. Like that, they're not, I'm not going to be that guy. So I think some of the tenderness and also recognizing our own shortcomings is really important in these spaces. And then I actually want to speak to this piece about intergenerational trauma, that I come from a people who have lived through trauma, and I experience their trauma through their parenting, but also my own traumas stem out of that. And I don't think of myself as somebody who, it just is part of my story. That's just that. And what I do put a lot of emphasis on in myself and in my family and in my people is the intergenerational resilience. And what are the social determinants of resilience? And we build on those. And those cannot be medicalized, pathologized, that actually it's the land that teaches us what our survival is and where we belong and who we belong to. And so, I've learned most profoundly about my strengths and felt most cared for in a canoe and with my people and singing our songs. And actually, those seem like they might just be sort of like, cultural activities. And they are. But, pre-contact those cultural activities, we didn't say, let's go do cultural activities. Let's go get in a canoe. We were just like, let's go to so-and-so's house. And that was a cultural activity. But actually returning to that is some of the intergenerational healing for the intergenerational trauma. And so I don't know how to say this without swearing. So if I offend people through swearing, some of the things is to get the fuck out of the way. Right? Colonial structures get out of the way. And people in high positions of power, get the fuck out of the way. We know what we need.
Thank you. I don't know how to follow that.
Wow, that's a big question. No. You know, when I watched the NBC interview with Mohammed and his soup kitchen, I was riveted to the spot. It's a great video. It sort of shows all the activity going around, the hundreds, if not thousands, of people coming to get their soup. I think there were 4 or 5 of these very, very large pots of soup cooking away. And I think, Adil, that's the doorway. The doorway is to find the resilience within the peoples who have survived, who will survive, who have always survived, and to allow them to lead us in how to support them. And they will show us the way because they are surviving. Of course, there will be enormous demands on providing acute care, of trying to stem the starvation, of trying to get emergency aid to pregnant people who are suffering with anemia, pregnant people who are starving, and we know that we need to rapidly make interventions because the children that will be born will have such a bad start in life. So I'm not putting aside the need for acute care and for acute interventions, but yes, as I said, you know, it's one of a few videos I've seen, of a few pictures I've seen, a few representations I've seen of resilience, and it really gives one hope. It really reminds one that people are in solidarity with one another, that they are in support of one another, and that the narrative that we have been provided, which is that because 60% of the people voted for Hamas, that everybody is a Hamas supporter and everybody is sort of painted with the same brush. So we need to look to the people, and we need to do that in our own country as well.
wanted to kind of remind us of how important it is to give back. So when we ask ourselves,
That's another big question. But I think it falls on actually really clearly from the points about the training of medical workers and the ways in which we're alienated, you know, in a sense from our own labor, right? And I don't necessarily mean that just in the kind of like capitalist Marxist sense, but alienated emotionally, alienated in an embodied way from the implications of the labor that we do, from seeing ourselves collectively rather than individually as workers, which is what our systems want us, and not understanding that the systems that we labor under, for example, that capitalism is always racial capitalism, is always implicated with colonialism, settler colonialism, and imperialism, but also that some of our strongest and proudest moments are when we come together as people who labor in diverse ways, to labor together for justice. And when we think about, I mean, my own family, you know, my grandfather, who was a German Jew, found refuge in Argentina, and, you know, when my family then settled on my father's side in Chile, and had to leave after the coup, you know, the dock workers in the UK prevented the warplanes from taking off to aid Pinochet in the same way that our dock workers are preventing, you know, munitions from being loaded, in the same way that our students and workers are coming together to block the infrastructure that provides the weapons and the logistics. So we're all workers, whether we're paid or not. Our labor matters, and our labor needs to be in the service of collective justice and liberation, in the face of systems that want us to labor just for money. So that's what I would say. I actually think I've said everything that I have to say. And so I would really love to give the last word to the rest of our panelists.
Thank you. A lingering thought that I really wanted to share was just around when we talk about health in the context of Gaza, I really hope we can continue to think about the intersectional ways in which we need to move a free Palestine forward, recognizing who are made structurally vulnerable, who are made vulnerable in this world, who are also dehumanized in this world, also in the context of Palestine, who are not just Palestinian, but they're also like physically or non-physically disabled, people who struggle with severe mental health issues, people with chronic diseases, people who are older adults, like Palestinian men, like people who are so dehumanized in the context of Palestine, where we have to be talking about children always. We have to be talking about women. We have to be talking about people who are pregnant. And yes, their lives matter, but so do the people with severe mental health, chronic diseases, disabilities. And in this current situation, there has been a lot of attention put on the physical impacts of bombings, airstrikes, missile strikes, drone attacks. And this is important because this is what is maiming and killing people on a daily basis. But there's this whole hidden, and I hope it's not so hidden moving forward, wave of non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases, cancers that are going undiagnosed completely. Dr. Ben Thompson, who's a nephrologist based in Canada, who recently came back from Gaza, speaks on this well, that there's no way to diagnose cancer now. Like, MRIs are completely destroyed, all of them. All the CT scanners have been destroyed except for one at the European Gaza hospital. And it's missing a part, and we're waiting on approvals from Israel to get that part. So this is for an imaging diagnosis. There's no way to get a tissue diagnosis for cancer because to get a sample, you have to get that tissue read by a pathologist. The pathologists in Palestine have been killed with their families. The pathology lab, the major one in the north at the Al-Shifa Medical Complex, is destroyed. So there's no way to diagnose cancer. There's no way to treat cancer, as we've heard. And this is just cancer. And then there's like heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure. Like these things are just, and the patients that will die from these conditions who have already died, they're not counted in this like dystopian, we were talking about it earlier, this like dystopian like weather news report where, oh, today this many Palestinians were killed, or around like 33,000 now. They're not even counted as a number because it's not seen as a direct cause of the genocide. It's not a direct cause of the structural oppression or the apartheid conditions, but they are, right? When healthcare is systematically attacked to the point where people are dying in by these chronic diseases and will continue to die from them even after a ceasefire. So I hope we continue to think about the ways in which we even conceptualize moving forward these shared struggles for liberation, these shared struggles for humanizing people who even here in the context of Canada are dehumanized because of their intersectional identity.
Maybe my the last thing that I just want to sort of surface or put in the foreground is my ongoing commitment to Palestinian people and the enormous, enormous gratitude I feel in our friendships and in our kinships that you would brazenly feel the future with me and brazenly speak about going home, and that until then you have a home in me and you have a home in our territories, and I will honor that always. Yeah.
I want to share a quote from a nephrologist, Dr. Hammam Allo, who was murdered by Israel during this last 6 months, and just started off by saying that Palestinians are not a helpless people, and I know that we haven't perpetuated that today. I just want to remind people that they are powerful, they are fierce, they are literally our teachers, our educators, they are our leaders in so many ways, and that we attend these events to follow in their lead and to uplift them and to be their net when they need somewhere to fall. We are there to be there with them, alongside them, hold their hand and fight for them. This is not a helpless group of people that we're here to save. I want to share that and highlight that through his quote, where he said in an interview, "And if I go, who treats my patients? You think I went to medical school for 14 years so I can only think about my life and not my patients? I'm asking you, ma'am, do you think this is the reason I went to medical school, to think only about my life? This is not the reason I became a doctor." And he was murdered, I believe, the following day after this interview. And he never abandoned his patients, and they are our leaders, and these are the people that are my heroes and who I follow in their lead.
You know, I think that what I'd like to take away is the inspiration to continue my unlearning and my learning. That's a lesson that I've learned coming to Canada in 2004 from South Africa, where I was thoroughly socialized in an apartheid system, and as a person with Jewish identity and ancestry, was socialized to be a Zionist. And I'm just so grateful to the compassion of indigenous peoples and Palestinian peoples that I've met, who've welcomed me into the journey of unlearning and learning.
Thank you all. My last remark is going to be a poem. I know many of you have heard this poem before. It's If I Must Die by Razing. And I'm reading it today because, well, first of all, there are no Palestinians up here, and I know that Dr. Nahla is, made sure to tell us that we also need to give our Palestinian colleagues, friends, community members a break, but also to tell them that we are here in solidarity. As they say in the protests, in our thousands and our millions, we're all Palestinians. But also, the reason why I'm reading this is because I think a lot of the events that are being organized, the talks, the workshops, the sessions, the discussions, all of the protests, is in some ways an answer to the call of their time. If I must die. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child